Nah.
I'd rather hear what they say about it after it's done.
Well,
I know the win.
yeah, I haven't. I definitely don't want to play any of the suggested drinking games that have been posted online today, you know. Drink every time Kamala laughs. No, not going to do that. All right, Carrie, I got 6 o'clock.
Okay, we're streaming live.
Tell me when we're rolling. Okay, we're good. We're good. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming again to the third of our summer lecture series. This one on Does History Repeat Itself? And I'm excited that we've been able to do this and that it's attracted some interest and attention. We're going to continue. We've already reserved the room, so to speak, for the next 3 months, and I'll announce a little bit about those next 3 lectures, which will be October, November, and December at the end. Let me pray for us first, and then we'll dive into tonight's topic. Father, thank you that we have the opportunity to gather, that to think about important issues, to consider what has happened in the past, to evaluate, see if we can detect patterns, to think about what you are doing in history. I pray this time would be productive and informative, and that everybody would leave better equipped to understand the times and to work in spreading the good news of your Son and advancing your kingdom. Pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so just a word about the Francis Schaeffer Study Center. This is our 21st year of conducting classes. Our mission is to promote a biblical worldview through the study of history, literature, and art, and it was named for Francis Schaeffer, who was a very influential theologian and apologist, 1912 to 1984. So in addition to sponsoring this lecture series, Schaeffer offers a high school program built around an integrated chronological study of Western civilization, beginning with the ancient world in 9th grade, finishing with the 20th century in 12th grade. And I'm the co-director alongside my wife, Cindy, who could not be here tonight. She's a little under the weather, but I'm hoping she's going to be doing better. She, I think, is going to be watching the live stream. We've been married for 47 years. We have 12 children, 19 grandchildren, and I haven't decided yet what I want to be when I grow up. But I have been trained as a historian, and I have done that quite a bit, and I teach. I teach high school students. I have taught college students. I teach live here to students at the Schaeffer Study Center on Wednesdays. I teach online to about 100 students every week in a Great Books program that's based out of Pennsylvania. And I love teaching high school kids. It's a blast. So here's a related question. What do fish know about water? Because we don't think about this question very often. I mean, if you think about does history repeat itself, it's just not something that occurs to us. We actually believe this. The culture believes this. This has been the dominant framework that everybody has understood history through since the Enlightenment, since sometime in the 1700s. This is what everybody has believed, that progress is the description of the history of mankind from ancient to modern. It's always been progress, sometimes steeper, sometimes shallower, but things have gotten better over time. And the nice thing about this view of history is it gives you an optimistic attitude toward events in the future. If you believe everything is always going to get better with the passage of time, then in order for things to get better, you just have to wait, and things will inevitably get better. Everybody believes in this. We don't even think about it because it's the water that we, the fish, are swimming in, and we don't notice it. But it's not what people have always believed. Everybody believes in it now, and they believe it's inevitable. The other side effect of this, of course, is not as fortunate as the optimism that it generates. Makes you optimistic about the future, but it makes you a little bit snobbish about the past. It means you think everybody in the past was inferior to us, that we have progressed beyond them, and that they somehow were primitive, and we don't really need to pay that much attention to them because we've already moved beyond wherever it was they were. We believe society is progressing. We believe technology is advancing, and it is. We believe disease will be eliminated because a lot of them have been. But we also believe old people are corrupted and young people are innocent. And maybe you can sense a little bit of the problems that might flow out of that conviction. If old people are corrupted and young people are innocent, we have some problems. This is not an attitude that's confined just to American historians. British historians believe it. German historians believed it. Marxist historians believe it. It's been the dominant mode of thinking about time and history and developments for the last 400 years. However, before 1750, not everybody believed in progress. In fact, most historians in the ancient world and the medieval world, especially the late medieval world, believed that over time things had gotten worse. The Greek historians talked about a golden age that things had declined from. And we'll talk more specifically about Greek history in a few minutes that will give you some of the reasons why they arrived at that conclusion. Roman historians, even in the years, well, especially in the years of the Caesars, what was called the golden age of Caesar Augustus, they were already looking back at the days of the Republic with more than a little bit of wistfulness and more than a little bit of thinking, you know, things have actually taken a wrong turn and they're not getting better. The Renaissance historians, the Renaissance is a fundamentally backward-looking intellectual phenomenon. Renaissance means rebirth, and the motto of the Renaissance was ad fontes. It's the Latin phrase, means back to the source, back to the fountain. We've lost something and we need to recover it. We are not as proficient as the ancient world was. We need to look backwards to recover the knowledge and the skills that used to be prevalent but are no longer. We have an inferior civilization. We can look back in the past, and we can see some superior examples in literature and art, even in politics and philosophy and theology. And the way to make progress, the way to improve our current society, is to try and recover some of the things that we lost. Enlightenment historians, well, long about 1750, they decided that the fundamental problem of mankind was that we were enslaved to tradition. And as Voltaire quaintly put it, mankind will not truly be free until the last king is strangled in the entrails of the last priest. Which is how we got the French Revolution. Because the French Revolution completely rejected the past. They wanted to throw off tradition. They saw tradition as enslaving, not just a burden, but enslaving. And that's kind of been the dominant mode. That's the dark side of the belief in progress, is the belief that the past is still oppressing us, and the quicker we can cut ourselves free from it, the sooner we will be free. Less talked about. It comes as a shock to most inhabitants of the 21st century, but progress is mostly a myth. There is nothing inevitable about it. The idea that the simple passage of time will allow things to improve flies in the face of experience. If you just wait for time to pass, will the dishes get washed? Will the rooms get cleaned? Did I mention we had 12 children? Yeah. If time passes, things do not automatically improve. Over time, does your car run better and better? And require less and less maintenance? Yeah, well, progress. It's unsettling to consider that maybe things are not getting better. It really is a truth we would probably just as soon avoid it's emotionally difficult for us to adjust our attitude toward time and toward our own history. But I want to go back. First lecture that we did to kick off the summer, we talked about the big timeline and the walk through Western history. So I want to go back and look at some of those ancient civilizations in particular and talk about them in light of this question of, is there evidence for progress? So I want to talk about Egypt and Greece and Rome and Israel. And here's the timeline. If you remember, we have the ancient world, the medieval world, the modern world. So let's go back and put Egypt up there. Egypt's got from about 2500 BC to about 500, 2700 is the Old Kingdom. Starting in 2000, you get the Middle Kingdom. Starting 1500 years before Christ, you have the New Kingdom. So if I have these three major periods of Egyptian history, and they divide them up by the dynasties, the families where the pharaohs come from that are ruling. I'm going to assume none of you are Egyptologists. When would you guess the Great Pyramids were built? Yes, I know that's a Lego model. I like Legos. Great Pyramid is the only one of the seven wonders of the ancient world that still survives. The other six are all destroyed. Great Pyramid was the tallest structure in the world for several thousand years. It's 400 feet tall. It's 2 million stone blocks. So, looking at the timeline, Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, when would you guess they built the pyramids? You know where I'm going. When I ask my high school students this, and they don't know anything about Egypt when we start, they always say, well, it would be the New Kingdom, because it must have taken them a long time to develop the skills, the technology, the resources to gather 2 million blocks of stone that weigh multiple tons each and assemble them into a 400-foot tall artificial mountain. When the truth is, third dynasty at the beginning of the Old Kingdom. When Abraham comes to Egypt, the pyramids are old. The pyramids are 600 years old when Abraham comes to Egypt. When Moses leads the tribes of Israel out of Egypt, Hebrew slaves did not build the pyramids. Joseph and his brothers probably moved to Egypt about 1900 BC. The pyramids are 800 years old. When the Exodus occurs, the pyramids are 700-800 years old. The fact that they're still there is really remarkable. It's an astonishing fact from the ancient world. They're one of the oldest structures on the planet. And they were much grander when they were completed. What we see is actually a bit of a ruin, although it's not immediately apparent. We see them sort of jagged step, but they finished them in polished limestone. The blocks are sandstone, but they finished out those steps of blocks with smooth, polished limestone from top to bottom, and they capped it with a gold-covered capstone that when it caught the sun would have been just stunning. So they would have been polished white and 400 feet tall. The base covers about 6 acres. But they were built at the very beginning of ancient Egyptian civilization. And Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom actually hides a fact that runs completely counter to the idea of progress. Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom are separated from each other because each of them begins with a burst of creativity and wealth and resource and accomplishment. They build pyramids. They go out on military expeditions and conquer their neighbors. They explore the coast of Africa. That all happens at the beginning, and then things slide. And the reason the Old Kingdom comes to an end is because there's a collapse into chaos. And all the little cities up and down the Nile rebel, separate from each other, economy declines, there are famines, there will be 3 different rulers in 3 different cities, each claiming to be Pharaoh, and there is civil war. And the intermediate periods happen for anywhere from 30 to 50 to 100 years. And then you get a reorganization, a reunification of Egypt, and they get the resources, and they accomplish things, and then you get a decline. So each of the first period lasts about 600 years, Middle Kingdom lasts about 400 years, New Kingdom lasts 1,000 years. The end of each one, Egyptian civilization has crumbled into chaos. Imagine that. Let's talk about Greece. Here's a quick outline of the major events in the history of Greece. The oldest thing we know about is the Trojan War, about 1000 BC, and we don't know a lot about that. My favorite quip about that is we have Homer's account of the Iliad and the Odyssey, which tell the story of the war against Troy, and we don't know anything about Homer. He names a bunch of kings, and we've found archaeological evidence of the kings. The tombs of the Mycenaean kings are there, but we don't know anything about Homer. And one of my favorite examples of weird historical conclusions is the very learned German analytical paper trying to decipher Homer and his relationship to the 2 poems. And it concludes with the startling assertion that the Iliad and the Odyssey could not have been written by Homer. They must have been written by another ancient Greek poet with the same name. But since we don't know anything about the Homer who wrote them, it's like, but they couldn't have been written by that Homer, right? They had to have been written by another, not the one you think, but another one that we also don't know anything about. Okay. We know Athens and Sparta get organized as city-states a century or 2 after. Athens and Sparta aren't really named in the Iliad and the Odyssey. They come later. So 800 BC, 700 BC, 600 BC is Solon and Aesop. And then you have these cataclysmic events where the Persian Empire, the ruler of Persia, attempts to invade and conquer Greece. And it's a David and Goliath story. There are 2 attempts to invade, and both of them are defeated by the Greek city-states. The first at the Battle of Marathon, the second at the Battle of Salamis, which is a naval battle led by the Athenian navy. And in there is Thermopylae as well, but Thermopylae is kind of an Alamo story. It's not a great Greek victory. It's a Greek last stand to delay the Persians to give everybody else a chance to get organized. And those Persian invasions, we're pretty clear about the dates, 493 and 483. Pericles is the generation after those successes. Pericles is the great ruler of Athens. It's under Pericles that the great temples on the Acropolis are built. So he turns Athens into a city of marble temples. But then toward the end of his life, civil war breaks out between the Greek city-states, between Athens and a group of cities allied with Athens, and Sparta and a group of cities allied with Sparta, and they have their own little 26-year war that devastates the whole peninsula. 70 years later, the king of Macedonia conquers all of the rest of Greece, which is not a good sign. Alexander the Great is a military dictator. His father, King Philip of Macedonia, had been a military dictator. He was a dictator, but he takes all of the resources of all of the cities, and he goes after the traditional enemy of the Greeks, which is the Persians. When you read the line, Alexander the Great conquered the world, that being translated is Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire. The Persians had tried twice to conquer Greece, and much to everybody's surprise, including the Greeks, they failed. And then the Greeks turn around not too much later, 330 or so, Alexander conquers the Persian Empire. But when Alexander dies, the kind of hollow nature of Greek civilization at that point is revealed, because immediately upon his death, the vast territory that he had conquered shatters into 5 different kingdoms. And you have a Greek cultural spread throughout the world, but you no longer have any political unity. There is a Greek general who rules Egypt. There is a Greek general who takes over in Antioch and who rules a kingdom that's roughly Syria and Israel. You have a Greek general who takes over in Asia Minor. You have a Greek general who takes over in Greece. There are a couple of generals who try and hold on to some of the Persian and Indian conquests, and they pretty rapidly fail. But Greek culture persists, but it's been fragmented. And then Greece is conquered by the Romans in 146 because essentially the Greeks had crumbled. Greek civilization had fallen on very hard times. And Greece becomes a province of the Roman Empire. And Greece remains a conquered, occupied, possessed country until the mid-19th century. The Greeks do not regain their independence until the 1840s and 1850s. They rebel against rule by the Ottoman Sultan, the Ottoman Empire. They're part of the Ottoman Empire. And the history of the Greek diaspora and the Greek suffering over those centuries under rule by outsiders, foreigners, rivals the history of the diaspora of the Jews. So the revival of Greece as a modern nation is a miraculous event. But you don't want to talk to the Greeks about progress from the ancient to modern, because the intervening years between the great age of Pericles, which is the high point of Greek civilization, to the reestablishment of the nation of Greece. By the way, they want Constantinople back. It's one reason why Greece and Turkey are not really happy members of the same alliance. There's a huge sentiment in Greece that would like to have Constantinople back because it's a Greek city. So are most of the cities along the eastern coast of the Aegean. They're Greek cities. They're not Turkish. Well, they are now, but they weren't always. So Greek history is not a history of unbroken progress. They get together, they get organized, they rather quickly achieve great things, and then it falls apart, and then there's 1,000 years of captivity. More than that, from 146 BC to 1850. They are a captive, conquered people. Rome. Everybody loves to talk about Rome. Everybody wants to know, well, let's talk about the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. No, let's not. We could talk about the rise and fall of the Roman Republic. It's a much more interesting question. Rome founded as a city in 753 BC. When the Greeks are fighting the Trojans, Rome doesn't exist yet. When the Persians are invading Greece, Rome is a small little town on the banks of a river with maybe 10,000 people. It's a little obscure town on the Italian peninsula. They run the kings out in 509 and establish the Roman Republic. That's their 1776. And they are a republic with a senate and elected consuls for 500 years. And it's during that 500 years that they expand and take over the Mediterranean. It becomes their lake. And right at the peak of their expansion and their wealth, the republic is overthrown by a bunch of generals. It starts in the 2nd century BC with Marius and Sulla, and then Julius Caesar and Caesar Augustus, and then it's just military dictators for the rest of the empire. The Roman Empire is a military dictatorship. I'm already researching the next talk I'm going to give next month on Constantine, the first Christian emperor. I'm going to try and salvage his reputation. When Constantine is proclaimed emperor by his troops, he is one of 5 people claiming to be emperor. He has to defeat the other 4. And that's because it's been a series of military dictatorships. Whoever's got an army can make a claim, but it's not been good. The last Roman emperor dies in 476, and Rome goes out with a whimper, not with a bang. It's not like somebody killed the last emperor, conquered Rome, and took it over. It's like they got overwhelmed by successive waves of armed illegal immigrants. literally. The Germanic tribes did not have kingdoms of their own. They didn't have a homeland that they were trying to annex Roman provinces to. They had abandoned their homelands because they were terrified of the Huns. And they were on the move. They were illegal immigrants crossing the river, the Danube in this case, and looking for a place to settle that would be safer. And so when the last emperor, the last person who carried the title and claimed to be emperor, dies in 476, it's not immediately obvious what's happened. It's like, oh, well, the emperor died. So which general is going to try and make a run at it now? Which general is going to try and take that title? And a year goes by and nobody has. And a couple of years go by and nobody has. And then, 10 years later, people look up and go, oh, I guess we don't have an emperor anymore. We have this Germanic king that nobody wants to tangle with. And yeah, there are couple of Germanic kings ruling the Italian peninsula. Odoacer and then Theodoric the Ostrogoth, but no emperor anymore. The truth is, I don't even want to talk about Israel. I did Egypt and Greece and Rome and Israel, but if you think about Israel, the history of Israel is not an unbroken record of progress. Not at all. There's, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Joseph's got the most roller coaster story. If you took it as a screenplay to Hollywood, they would reject it for being too unrealistic. That's crazy. Something that crazy would never happen. He's sold into slavery and then he winds up as prime minister. How are you going to make that believable? Yeah, hillbilly elegy. Yeah, there we go. But Israel, the Exodus, and then the period of the Judges, which has its ups and downs. The frightening thing about the book of Exodus is, and then there arose a generation that did not remember what God had done and who worshiped the idols. And so God sent an oppressor. Wash, rinse, repeat. It's like a dozen times. The last judge is Samuel. Then they get kings. They have 3 kings over all 12 tribes. Saul, David, Solomon. And then it starts to fall apart. And the 10 northern tribes are wiped out by, guess who? The Persians. The Assyrians and then the Persians. The 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, are defeated by Nebuchadnezzar, taken to Babylon. And the revival that occurs under Ezra and Nehemiah, and I'll put a plug in for Pastor Larry's series on Nehemiah, talking about what occurs in the last historical books of the Old Testament, coming back to Jerusalem, rebuilding the altar and the temple and the walls and reorganizing, but that is done under the Persian Empire. Nehemiah is the Persian governor appointed by the Persian emperor. He's an official in the Persian government. Israel's not independent. One day I guess we ought to do a series on the Maccabees and the rebellion against the Greeks, but that's in the Apocrypha. It's not in the canon. But then Israel spends the next 1,800, 1,900 years as a conquered people with a diaspora, a conquered, oppressed land. And the reestablishment of the nation of Israel is an even bigger miracle in historical terms. But you certainly can't say that the history of Israel has been an unbroken line of progress. If you think about the golden age of Israel, it's the kingship of David and Solomon. And at Solomon's death, it starts to fall apart. There's a rebellion and a split, and often civil war. And you trace the lines of the 2 kings, and every single king of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, is wicked after their father Jeroboam. The southern tribes have 5 or 6 kings who get some words of approval, but a majority of those kings are judged to have been idolaters. So you can't talk about progress in the history of Israel. All right. There are remarkable periods scattered throughout history in which a group of men or a generation seems to have been supernaturally empowered to reverse the trend. I think from the 4 examples I've already given you, from Egypt and Greece and Rome and Israel, the majority of the centuries in all 4 of those ancient civilizations, things are slipping. Things are going downhill. The periods of accomplishment are much shorter. They're much more compressed. This sawtooth pattern is tilted for a reason. Accomplishment occurs largely in a single generation. And the succeeding generations feed off of the capital that is laid up, whether that's economic capital or political capital or cultural and artistic capital. The accomplishments seem to be compressed in a single generation. And what happens then is decline. Maybe slow at first, and then more and more rapid as time goes on. Sometimes the progress is in literary accomplishment. Sometimes it's in science. Sometimes it's in politics. Sometimes it's in art or music. But then inevitably, after a period of achievement, there's a long, slow period of decay that sets in. The Greek city-states, in a burst of creativity around 800 or 900 years before Christ, founded cities, wrote constitutions, served them admirably for generations. But over time, the cities and their leaders seemed to become more and more unworkable and corrupt. And eventually, most of the Greek cities were ruled by tyrants. And then they were conquered by the Macedonian armies of Alexander and then by the Romans. But there is that brief period. The Romans created a republic, 500 BC. And their founding story is quite admirable. Expel the tyrants, expel the kings. Let the people of the city of Rome choose their own rulers and choose them in annual elections. But over time, their structures developed more and more problems. Generals got more powerful, and people in charge in Rome politically began to use lawfare. They began to prosecute their political opponents and try and outlaw them. And when things degenerated into lawfare, the generals had no reason to give up their command of their troops. That's Julius Caesar's rebellion. Julius Caesar was recalled from Gaul, and he had a legion. He had conquered 1,000 cities, taken 1 million prisoners. And Pompey, who was the first man in Rome, said, okay, you've been up there for 5 years. It's time for you to come home. You need to turn your legions in Gaul over to a successor. And Caesar's going, if I come back to Rome without an army, they're going to put me on trial. And they're going to, at the very least, take all of my wealth. I'm not liking the echoes in my head right now. They're at the very least going to take all of my wealth, and they might put me in prison or kill me. And so he says, I'm not giving up command of my armies. I'm coming back from Gaul, but I'm bringing the army with me because you're not going to put me on trial. You're not going to take everything I've assembled. And that's the beginning of the end of the Republic. And then he sets the precedent of, if you have an army, you can achieve political power. And so his nephew, Caesar Augustus, has an army and defeats his rivals. And every Caesar after that is a general. The emperors, the military dictators who called themselves emperors and gods, but that 500-year period from Caesar Augustus is the high point. It is all downhill from there. And Caesar Augustus as a high point, it's really not because as an emperor, he has gathered all that much capital. It's because the 500 years of the Republic had achieved so much that they could persist for 500 years even as their political structures have decayed. They eat all that capital up. The decline of the city of Rome is particularly depressing and disturbing to contemplate. It grew to a population of 1 million by the age of Augustus. with running water and an incredible economic network around the Mediterranean. They were importing grain every year on huge fleets of ships from North Africa. Their breadbasket was the North African coast. They fed 1 million people. And the city was remarkably safe to live in. There was a remarkably prosperous middle class. And then by 410, there are already serious signs of incredible trouble. It is sacked in 410, and again in 455, and again in 472, and again in 546. And after 478, there's no longer an emperor. And the German kings choose Milan and Ravenna as their capitals. In 1305, the Bishop of Rome, who's by now taken the title Pope, himself abandons the city because it's too dangerous a place to live. And he moves temporarily to southern France. He's there for 70 years. They called it the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. Population of the city of Rome after 1305 falls below 20,000 people. They are literally camping in the ruins. And the few families, sort of tribal local politics at that point, the few families that still make a residence in Rome, take over the ruins of ancient buildings. One family takes over the Colosseum and converts it to their family tribal residence with apartments and little shanties in it. 3 or 4 other major structures. Travelers in the late Middle Ages describe what it was like to go to Rome and to come down the highways and the roads that the Romans had built to last. And they start seeing ruined buildings. They start seeing the remains of buildings that are uninhabited, bits of marble and statuary and villas and courtyards, and there's nobody living there. And they walk for miles, and they get to the inhabited part of the city, which is just in the middle of these ruined buildings stretching out in all directions. And when Italy revives, it's not really Rome, it's the northern cities that revive in 12th and 13th century. The Renaissance, it's an interesting phenomenon. It's a deliberate rejection of the idea of progress, the inevitability of progress. I mentioned its motto, which is looking back to the past. The writers, painters, leaders of the Renaissance looked backward in time to men who they perceived as more accomplished than themselves. They said, we don't build anything like the Romans did. We don't write Latin that's near as eloquent as what the Romans wrote. We don't do any kind of statuary like what the Romans did. We don't have any paintings. We don't build any churches that were as big. They go, we need to actually go back and revive what the Romans did. Revive their literature, revive their art, maybe even start thinking about reviving their political structures. That comes a little later. But in many ways, the Reformation is just the third generation of Renaissance development. The Reformation is an attempt to say, hey, we've gone a long way down the wrong road. And the right way to correct the problems in the church is not to make more progress. The right way to correct the problems in the church is to go back to the New Testament church and recover the core of the gospel and the core of church life from the first century. So the reformers, most of them were actually trained as Renaissance humanists. They're trained in Renaissance scholarship. They're trained in Renaissance writing. They had read the Greek and Roman classics. They learned the languages, and it's learning the languages that were recovered by the first couple of generations of the Renaissance that enables the reformers to recover the original Greek and Hebrew text of the Bible and translate it for their people. And the revival of the ancient world in the Renaissance continues actually for quite some time. It starts in the late 1300s into the 1400s, but The political thinkers of the 17th and 18th century, including the American founding fathers, were continuing the Renaissance revival of Greek and political thought. The American founding fathers all read the Roman political commentaries. They all read Roman history. They all knew Roman history. That's why so many of our political institutions have Latin names. That's why we have a Senate and a House of Representatives. They were trying to recreate the Roman Republic very consciously. And most of us are familiar with this depiction of George Washington. This is actually a statue that's in Richmond. The state legislature commissioned this for their meeting house. But not too much longer after this, there's this statue, which has had a kind of a checkered history in terms of its location. Everybody was a little shocked by it when it was first revealed. That is French, or no, that's actually an American sculptor, although he was in Italy working in the time. Cost a fortune to get that statue back from Italy. And they put it outdoors at the Capitol, and people were kind of wondering, nobody ever saw George Washington with his shirt off. So we're not sure. But he is actually posed as a Roman consul. He's wearing a Roman toga. And it made its way eventually to the Smithsonian. It's now in the Museum of American History. I think it's up on the second floor if you want to visit it. So, does history repeat itself? Is it chart A, or chart B, or chart C? And maybe one of the questions we should ask is, has there been progress or decay in our own civilization since the founders? Have we really made progress? I'm not talking about a new iPhone every year. Have we really made progress? Have we improved the republic? Or has it deteriorated and decayed? The answer to those questions have a lot of implications. If the republic has deteriorated, then maybe what we need to do is reverse directions and try to return to the ideals of the founders. We need to shed the mistakes of later, lesser political compromises. If we've progressed, well then, we need to continue correcting and eliminating the mistakes and omissions of the founders. But have we progressed? We have to ask ourselves, is our generation, the 21st century, really better equipped, more noble, admirable, and politically sophisticated than Washington, Madison, and Jefferson? That's the question that we should be preparing our teenagers to reflect on and begin to answer. And it's absolutely not the thing that's being taught in public education. The question never arises. The trick is to get our students to move beyond the simple models and to think critically about whatever time period they're studying, because there are times of achievement and accomplishment and progress, admittedly. We can give you examples from a bunch of different civilizations. But then there are also periods of decay and decline and deterioration that lead so often to some very incredibly tragic circumstances. So the question we have to ask is, what's going on? There's nothing inevitable about the arrow pointing one way or the other. You have to sort of evaluate, is this a generation that's making accomplishments, or is this generation feeding off of prior years and deteriorating? So if our students learn to step back and ask that question about the facts, and ask questions about the views of the historians who are supplying the facts, because the historians usually have an answer and a model that they're using and that they marshal the facts to support. But look at what all the contemporaries say. Look at what the historical documents say. If you can teach students how to do that, then they have a much more sophisticated understanding of history and the ability to think in a much more sophisticated way about our own age. They will have begun to acquire discernment about what God is doing in our times and how we should be praying and preparing and participating in the great debates and movements of our time. So one of my favorite answers to this question, does history repeat itself? Actually, I like this quote from Voltaire. History never repeats itself, but man always does. Because human nature hasn't changed. We have 4,000 years of recorded history. And one of the astonishing things that if you give students original writing to read is that they will discover, people 1,000 years ago, people 2,000 years ago were just like us. Just like us. They didn't have cell phones, but they were just like us. All right, where are we going to go from here? This was the third and final lecture of the summer. October 15th, I'm going to talk about Constantine, try and rescue his reputation. November 12th, we're going to talk about Augustine, the towering figure in not just the ancient world, but in the whole history of the church. Augustine is the most influential theologian in the history of the church. And what's amazing about him is he wrote 5 million words that we still have. He's the most read theologian in every century after he wrote. His works were preserved through the Middle Ages and studied when the universities were founded and the theology faculties. He inspired Luther and Calvin, continues to inspire theologians. Everybody goes back and has to deal with Augustine. And Augustine is the most Pauline of the ancient theologians as well. And then December, a little bit of a Christmas present. I want to talk about Dante. If you're not familiar with Dante, I hope this will be a treat for you. Dante wrote an epic poem, 100 cantos. Each canto is a poem about 130 lines long. So 100 poems, 130 lines long each, 34 cantos in Inferno, 33 cantos in Purgatorio, 33 cantos in Paradiso. And if you've just read Inferno, you don't know the story. You need to get to the end of the story, because at the end of the story, it's an epic journey. At the end of the story, Dante tries to tell us what it's like to enter into the presence of God and to describe in poetry and words what it would be like to see God. It is just an astonishing poem. I started teaching it 11 years ago, and the first time I taught through it, all 3 books, I got to the end and I went, I need to go back and read the beginning again. And every year since then, I've had the same emotional response at the end. I go, I saw things this time I never saw before. So I hope you will catch some of my passion and enthusiasm for Dante. That's all I got. I hope that was helpful. Thank you for coming. And I hope you will come back next month as we continue with Constantine.
All right, everybody needs to go home, turn television
Yep.
off. 8 o'clock.
Yeah, and try and decide whether we are making progress or not.